Hello everyone, I am here to talk today about the effectiveness of COVID vaccine boosters here in the midst of 2023. And the reason I want to talk about this isn't necessarily to dig into exactly how effective vaccines are. This is an area that's been trod upon multiple times, but it does give me an opportunity to talk about a neat study design called the test negative case control design, which has some unique properties when you're trying to evaluate the effect of something outside of the context of a randomized trial. So just a little bit of background to remind everyone where we are. These are the number of doses of COVID vaccines administered over time throughout the pandemic. And you can see it's stratified by age here. The orange lines are adults ages 18 to 49, for example. You see a big wave of vaccination when they first came out at the start of 2021, and then subsequent, smaller waves after the first and second booster authorization. Maybe a bit of a pickup, particularly amongst older adults when the bivalent boosters were authorized, but still very little overall pickup of the bivalent booster compared to the monovalent vaccines, which might suggest vaccine fatigue going on this far into the pandemic. But it's important to try to understand exactly how effective those new boosters are, at least at this point in time. So the reason I'm talking about this is from this manuscript, which came out in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report very recently, which uses this test negative case control design to evaluate the ability of bivalent mRNA vaccines to prevent hospitalization. So the question here, my mentor always said, the question is, what is the question? What is the question? Does receipt of a bivalent COVID vaccine booster prevent hospitalizations, ICU stay, or death? That may not be the question that is of interest to everyone. I know people are interested in symptoms and obviously and missed work and transmission, all those things. Not what this paper was looking at: hospitalization, ICU stay, and death. Okay, so what's kind of tricky here is that the data they're using is on people who are hospitalized with various diseases. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive to ask yourself, how can you estimate the vaccine's ability to prevent hospitalization using only data from hospitalized patients? You might look at that on the surface and say, well, you can't, that's impossible. But you can, actually, with this cool test negative case control design. So here's basically how it works. You take a population of people that are hospitalized and confirmed to have COVID. Okay, now some of them in the hospital will be vaccinated and some of them will be unvaccinated. And the proportion of vaccinated and unvaccinated doesn't tell you very much because, of course, it depends how that compares to the rates in the general population, for instance. Of course, even the rates in let me clarify this because people misunderstand this a lot, right? So if 100% of the population were vaccinated, then 100% of the people hospitalized with COVID would be vaccinated. That doesn't mean vaccines are bad. Put another way, if 90% of the population was vaccinated and 60% of people hospitalized with COVID were vaccinated, that would actually show that the vaccines were working to some extent, all else being equal. So it's not just the raw percentages that tell you anything. Some people are vaccinated, some people won't. You need to understand what the baseline rate is. Now, what the test negative case control design is, it looks at people who are hospitalized without COVID. Now, who those people are, who your controls are in this case, is something you really need to think about. In the case of the CDC study that I'm talking about, they used people who were hospitalized with COVID-like illnesses, flu-like illnesses, respiratory illnesses, pneumonia, influenza, etc. And this is a pretty good idea because it standardizes a little bit for people who, number one, have access to healthcare, right? They can get to a hospital, and they're the type of person who would go to a hospital when they're feeling sick. So that's maybe a better control than the general population overall, which is something I like about this design. Now, some of those people who don't have COVID, they're in the hospital for flu or whatever, will have been vaccinated for COVID, of course, and some will not have been vaccinated for COVID. And of course, we don't expect COVID vaccines necessarily to protect against the flu or pneumonia, certainly. But that gives us a way to standardize. So if you look at these two, the Venn diagrams I've created here, I've got vaccinated and unvaccinated being exactly the same proportion, which would suggest that, okay, you're just as likely to be hospitalized with COVID if you're vaccinated as you are to be hospitalized with some other respiratory illness, which suggests that it's not, the vaccine isn't particularly effective. However, if you saw something like this, where looking at all those patients with flu and other non-COVID illnesses, a lot more of them had been vaccinated for COVID. What that tells you is, oh, we're seeing less vaccinated people hospitalized with COVID than we would expect because we have this standardization from other respiratory infections. Hope that makes sense. So we kind of expect this many vaccinated people because that's how many vaccinated people there are who show up with flu. But in the COVID population, there's less, and that would suggest that the vaccines are effective. So that is the test negative case control design. And you can do the same thing with ICU stays and death as well. It's just you change this hospitalized here to death and hospitalized here to death. Now, there's some assumptions here which you might already be thinking about. The most important one is that vaccination status is not associated with the risk of the disease. So I always think of older people in this context, right? Older people during the pandemic, at least in the US, were much more likely to be vaccinated, but also much more likely to contract COVID and be hospitalized with COVID. Now, the test negative design actually accounts for this in some sense because older people are also more likely to be hospitalized for things like flu and pneumonia, so there's some control there. But to the extent that older people, for example, are uniquely susceptible to COVID compared to other respiratory illnesses, that would bias your results to make the vaccines look worse. So standard approach here, you adjust for things. I think the CDC adjusted for age, sex, race, ethnicity, and a few other things to settle down and see how effective the vaccines were. So let's get to a worked example. This is the actual data from the CDC paper. So they had 6,907 individuals who were hospitalized with COVID. 26% of them were unvaccinated. Of course, what's the baseline rate that we would expect to be unvaccinated? Well, there were 59,234 individuals who were hospitalized with a non-COVID respiratory illness, and 23% of them were unvaccinated. So you can see there are sort of more unvaccinated people than you would think in the COVID group. In other words, less vaccinated people, which suggests that the vaccine works to some degree because it's keeping some people out of the hospital. Now, 26% versus 23% is not a very impressive, difference. But it gets more interesting when you break it down by the type of vaccine and how long ago the individual was vaccinated. So you can see that here. So let's walk through the all group on this side. What you can see is a calculated vaccine effectiveness. If you look at just the monovalent vaccine here, okay, this is, we see a 20% vaccine effectiveness. So this means that you're, preventing 20% of hospitalizations basically due to COVID by people getting vaccinated. That's okay, but certainly not anything to write home about. But what we see really interestingly is much better vaccine effectiveness with the bivalent vaccine if it had been received within 60 days. Now, this is, remember, the way this works is this compares people who received the bivalent vaccine within 60 days in the COVID group and the non-COVID group. So that sort of concern that the vaccine was given very, very recently affects both groups equally, so shouldn't result in bias there. And then, again, really interesting, what you see is this step off in vaccine effectiveness from 60 days 60 to 120 days, and here greater than 120 days. So we're talking, this is 4 months, folks. 4 months, and you've gone from 60% to 20%. When you break that down by age, you can see a similar pattern in the 18 to 65 group, and potentially some more protection in the age greater than 65 group. But somewhat disconcerting. Now, why is vaccine efficacy going down? The study doesn't tell us, but we can hypothesize that this might be an immunologic effect, right? The antibodies are sort of waning over time, or the protective T cells are waning over time. This could also reflect changes in the virus, in the environment, as the virus seeks to evade certain immune responses. But overall, suggesting that, waiting a year between booster doses may not, may leave you sort of exposed for quite some time, although maybe the take home here is that bivalent vaccines in general are probably a good idea for the proportion of people who haven't gotten them. When we look at critical illness and death, the numbers look a little bit better. So you can see bivalent better than monovalent, certainly pretty good with it if you've received it within 60 days. It does tend to wane a little bit, but not nearly as much. So you're still got about 50% vaccine efficacy out beyond 120 days when we're looking at critical illness, which is stays in the ICU, and death. Of course, I think that really the overriding thing to think about this when we're thinking about vaccine policy is that the way you get immunized against COVID is either by vaccine or by getting infected with COVID, or both. And this really interesting graph from the CDC shows over time, unfortunately only updated through Q3 of 2022, the proportion of Americans based on routine lab tests who have varying degrees of protection against COVID. And what you can see is that by Q3 of 2022, just 3.6% of people who, got their blood drawn at a commercial laboratory had no evidence of infection or vaccination. In other words, totally naive, totally protected. Almost no one, right? 4% of people. And then you've got 26% of people who had never been infected. They only have vaccine antibodies. 22% of people that look like they've only been infected, never been vaccinated. And then 50% of people who have had both. So there's a tremendous amount of existing immunity out there. And the really interesting questions about future vaccination and future booster doses is, how does it work on the background of this pattern? And what the CDC study doesn't tell us, and I don't think they have the data to tell us, is the vaccine efficacy in these different groups. Is it more effective in people who have only had infection, for example? Is it more effective in people who have only had vaccination versus people who have had both, or certainly people who have no protection whatsoever? Those are the really interesting questions that need to be answered going forward as vaccine policy gets developed in the future. So thanks. I hope this was a helpful primer on how the test negative case control design can answer questions that seem a little bit unanswerable. I'll see you next time.